We're all guilty of this. Walking down the street, staring at our phone, and neglecting our surroundings until you hear a car coming your way. But the cars of the future might sound completely different, like this. That's the sound of BMW's Vision M Next, which was composed by Hans Zimmer, one of the most famous movie score composers of all time. Or like this. That's the sound of Volkswagen's ID3, which was created by Leslie Mandoki, a composer who played drums in the European disco band Genghis Khan. So why are these cars making artificial sounds? And why are automakers tapping music composers to create them? First off, what do the Vision M Next and ID3 have in common? Well, they're electric vehicles, which typically sound like this. And that can be a problem, since we use our sense of sound to alert ourselves to oncoming traffic and other potential dangers. So if you were, say, distracted by your phone while crossing the street and a noiseless EV was headed your way, you'd be more likely to get hit. In fact, one study shows a hybrid vehicle accelerating on its electric motor is 1.18 times more likely to hit a pedestrian and 1.5 times more likely to hit a cyclist than a vehicle with an internal combustion engine. Lawmakers in the US and Europe have passed a new regulation to minimize these risks. The solution is an acoustic vehicle alerting system, or AVAS, which requires hybrids and EVs to emit a sound that alerts pedestrians and cyclists to their presence. But sound doesn't only make EVs safer. It's also a way for automakers to give their cars a voice, or a sonic identity, just as a Porsche has an unmistakable sound. Something like Nissan's LEAF can now have its own sound, handcrafted by a musical genius, like Danny Vin, the lead producer and creative director for the Nissan LEAF AVAS tone.
When the project came in, it was framed as like, there's a new regulation in town, and we're going to put sound to the regulation. And I had to kind of turn my head around to think about, if I go to look for a car, go shopping for a car, when that car rolls in front of me, the way it looks, the way it moves, and the way it sounds is going to have some sort of emotional impact that's going to make you be like, I want that.
Nissan, like other automakers, wanted to turn its AVAS tone into a marketing device. Simply put, the AVAS tone would become an audio logo for the Nissan LEAF. And who better to compose a sound like that than a composer or a team of people who have studied sound and understand how to use it as a tool to market products. But first, Vin and her team had to figure out what instruments to use.
That piece of audio I'm talking about is going to be about 2 seconds or less looped. And so 2 seconds of sound that's looped has to sound smooth. We experimented with a wide range of instruments. That said, I wanted to explore what suggests movement and power and energy.
Vin and the rest of her team experimented with sounds she categorized as pulsating, wavering, and smooth. Pulsating sounds mimic an engine in the way they bounce up and down abruptly. Wavering sounds are similar, but are much smoother in the way they bounce between notes. And smooth sounds are, well, smooth, solid tones that don't waver or bounce at all.
You really have to go for instruments that don't have a hard attack to them. Wind instruments, flutes, oboes, clarinets, the tone in wind instruments can be more like this, right? They can kind of waver a bit, have a little wave to them.
Finding tones and instruments that work was only the start of composing the AVAS tone. The sound had to be active. For every kilometer per hour, the tone increases in pitch and speed by 1%, up to 30 kilometers per hour or 18.6 miles per hour. This way, pedestrians and cyclists have an audio cue of what the car is doing. After 30 kilometers per hour, there's enough wind and road noise to alert pedestrians to a car's presence.
This might be a sampled flute. Can't remember at this point. You can also, I started blending the pulsing sounds, all right? Some of these pure organic tones, even though I like them, they ended up sounding a little spooky, you know, a little like Ghost. Some of the smoother ones, like that, even though this feels a little bit like, that feels a little bit to me like a vacuum cleaner, though it did suggest a certain amount of power. What we found, though, is that we kept moving more towards sounds that had a pureness to them. And that led us to use a lot of sounds that were synthetic, even though they might be warm and rich sounding, but using sounds that came from a synthesizer and then really manipulating those sounds, layering them with different ones, because we could have that complete control and stability. And I think that idea of like control and stability translates then emotionally to like good engineering.
While increasing in pitch and speed, the sound had to stay within the required frequency range. Once Vin and her team had a sound that Nissan approved, they used an equalizer to process the audio, adjusting various frequency ranges to make sure it met all the requirements of the regulation.
That's when it got to be very difficult to adjust things too much further than where the regulation needed to be. My engineers and mixers were going in with a very fine-tooth comb to just EQ it exactly. And that last stage of it was, I wouldn't call it creatively inspiring, it was challenging. It was very challenging.
Designing an AVOS sound is much more complicated than it seems. The tone is twofold. On one hand, it needs to alert pedestrians and cyclists to a car's presence to mitigate collisions. And on the other, it needs to radiate a pleasant tone, one that will attract people to the car and the brand.